Can I have everybody's attention, please? We're going to get started with our panel on polling and media. We're here in the Purple Tent at the RNC in Cleveland. The Purple Tent is the destination for civil dialogue, both literally and figuratively. America's heritage has always been under a tent, you know, people talking under the tent, and the parties want to consider that they have a big tent. So we put this Purple Tent here in Cleveland for safe dialogue, civil dialogue, and exploring critical issues about how we talk to one another, who we are and what we stand for, and what are the shared values of America that we can rally around. This panel is on polling and media, just to frame the issue, let me say a few words. Bias in numbers and in the media can promote extremism, hatred, and panic to the public, but it can also lead us to greater civility and more productive debate. Now, I want to mention to the panel, I know that one of the iconic media companies in the United States is Scripps Howard, and their slogan is, show them the light, and give them the light and show them the way. So one of my questions, which I hope Lou will pick up on, is media doing that? But some of the other issues that we're going to talk about is what do we need to know about what's behind our polling numbers, how do polls drive us, and how can polls lead us either to the negative talk or the positive talk. Our panelists are Kellyanne Conway, who's the chief pollster for the Trump campaign, Kevin Cirilli, who is a Bloomberg reporter traveling with the Trump campaign, Cliff Young, who is president of Ipsos Polling, Frank LaRose, who is the Ohio State senator who has forged a civility caucus with others on the other side. Frank is a Republican in the Ohio State Senate. And this panel is moderated by mediator Lou Krause, who is president of Better Outcomes. Welcome, everybody.
Okay, we're going to do this.
Did I forget somebody?
No, I don't think so. Does somebody want to be mentioned again? No? Okay. We're going to do this a bit informally.
Sorry about that.
I think if Stuart will get it.
Yeah, sorry about that, Dan.
Okay. This is the last of these panels, and I've been here for 3 days, so I've seen 5 panels before me, and they've raised all kinds of issues. Our focus in this session is values. What are American values? Who are we? And I'm particularly concerned about how we communicate. Because with the advent of the internet and cell phones and all that stuff, face-to-face communication is very difficult. And unfortunately, the way I see it, I don't know if I'm right or not, it just seems like because things are so fragmented, people don't trust the information that they're getting. And you have, people who are questioning solid science and all kinds of things that we weren't used to before when you could talk to somebody face to face and see their reaction and you knew if they weren't telling the truth or not. So where I'd like to start, and I don't mean to put our polling people on the spot, but I'd like to know, first of all, how do you go about collecting the information and then vetting it, or whatever term you want to use, to make sure that it's accurate? And then what happens when you feed it to the media and all of that back and forth, all of that back and forth stuff that goes into what we see at the end of the line?
Go, Kelly.
I'm happy to start. Thank you very much for having me, Shelley Himes and the Purple Tent, and everybody who's interested in this topic, and the panelists, of course. So I won't go through a tutorial on polling, but I will tell you that the way we collect information is through a variety of methodologies. Traditional telephone polling, obviously you have to have a very large cell phone complement within that. mainframe sample, 40, 45, 50%. If you're in urban areas, much higher. If you're talking to millennials, higher. Some people do online polling. They do IVR, push the button, dial polling. Most of what we do is still by telephone with this cell phone. The way we ensure that it is representative of the population that we are promoting it as being representative of is to make sure we know what the quotas are up front. So we understand what the representation within our larger population or electorate, which is different, by race, by gender, by age, by party affiliation to the extent you can do that, and by geography. One of my major grievances against polling, against the industry, is how much people are weighting the data, W-E-I-G-H-T. You need to do that once in a while, or for some hard to reach groups, but I have seen where people just get what they get and they don't get upset, they just weight the data up to where it needs to be. You really can't do that. You have to weight W-A-I-T instead of weight W-E-I-G-H-T, the data, to make sure that you are filling those subsets with an adequate number of individuals that you've actually reached on the phone and surveyed. Most of what I do, most of what I've done in 28 years in polling and 21 years at my own firm has never seen the light of day. Why? Because clients are paying us, they're hiring us to give them strategic advice. I tell them your polling data is proprietary and confidential. Mm-hmm. The last thing they want me to do is go shout it from the rooftops. And we do a lot of non-political work, so that would go for consumer branding or crisis communications as well. What I find to be unfortunate is how much polling is now done almost exclusively for media consumption. People looking to get their data in the news and break news, and sometimes if you're going to break news, it means that your poll showed a result that the other 19 polls did not show. So yours is the outlier and it gets picked up because it looks different, and we should really go back a little bit and say, well, why does it look different? Is it the outlier, or did you do something wrong or differently? I'm a big First Amendment fan, so I think if people want to do polling, that's great. However, there's a lot of media polling now, and there's a lot of academic polling, and yet if it's a, quote, Republican pollster, I still don't know what that means, actually. My polls aren't Republican. If there's a Republican pollster and a Democratic pollster, right away it's up. You can't trust a partisan pollster. I mean, I would argue if an editorial page is constantly against one of the two major candidates or endorses one of the candidates over the other, or a university is doing polling, what's to say that, why is that imbued with automatic non-allegiance, when clearly if you read the paper, you listen to the professors for 5 seconds, you know that that's not true. So that's a deeper dive into your topic, but it's a very serious one that I think is missed by many consumers of news who just say, I saw the poll. You should basically ask what 3-year-olds ask their mother, Mommy, where do babies come from? You should really just want to know where the poll came from and how it was done.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah.
Cliff?
I want to touch a bit on the different types of pollsters, and then maybe more generally about the importance of polling when it comes to democracy. Because it's one of the only constant and consistent feedback loops between the population and the decision makers. And we'll come back to that for a second, but I want to make a distinction here, just to define things. There's public pollsters and there's political pollsters, right? My firm, Ipsos, which I run, I'm a professional pollster as well, we're public pollsters. We produce polls for public consumption, for the media. Kellyanne, now you do some of that as well. I've seen in your past. You work a lot with clients specifically on strategic issues, whether it be political or non-political. There is in the United States a distinction between the two, and it typically goes to the issue of credibility and public trust. The notion or the idea is that a political pollster couldn't or wouldn't produce an unbiased poll. Obviously, I don't believe that, right? Specifically, many political pollsters, most political pollsters are very sort of high-level professionals. But when it goes to public opinion, and you do public opinion on public opinion, there is this notion that those parties that are involved with politics have some sort of skin in the game. So in the US, there's a distinction between public pollsters, Ipsos, Gallup, Pew, that produce information for the general discourse, for general consumption. We don't have political affiliations. In the US, we draw a line at parties and politicians. And political pollsters who are in the thick and thin with their clients, giving strategic advice. Now, in other countries, we're very puritanical in the U.S. Like, there's a puritanical strain in the U.S. I worked for a number of years, for 10 years in Brazil and Latin America, and many other countries, there's no distinction between public and private pollsters. You do a little bit of everything, okay? But I want to make that sort of initial distinction. We both have a very important role in democracy. We provide information for the general public. The political pollsters like Kellyanne are providing information to political and economic decision makers, and in both cases, those roles are important.
Okay. When I was doing my research this morning, it was a little bit late, I found that there are professional organizations in your industry. What do they do to, I mean, do they have a part in keeping everybody honest? It's a lousy way to say it, but.
I'll jump in, and then Kellyanne, okay, I'll jump in. So this goes to the issue of, can I trust the polls? Right?
Right.
And I'll just kind of like tweak the question a bit, and I'll get an answer to your specific question in a second. Okay. How do you trust a poll? There's so much out there, so much information, right? One solution is to regulate them. We don't regulate in the U.S. It doesn't jive with our culture. We're a smaller government culture writ large when compared to other countries, but approximately 90 other countries in the world have very strict regulation. We don't do that, right? We do self-regulation. We have professional bodies like the American Association for Public Opinion Research that defines the professional standards for what is a good poll and a bad poll. Now, there's an entire science behind polling. This science came to the fore in the 20s and the 30s. We've been perfecting it ever since then. We started off polling, knocking on doors and going to people's homes. We migrated to telephones. Now we're not even doing telephones as much. We're doing some sort of internet and telephone mix, or purely internet. But the point being is, while the tools have changed over time, the science has existed since the 20s and 30s, okay? Now the question is, what's a good poll? And there is a science, and it's pretty technical, but for the common user, the average person that's consuming the polls, I would say the following. I believe that brand and reputation matters. I believe that track record matters, both in terms of performance, but also being seen as a credible provider of information on public opinion. And that brand doesn't have to be a polling firm like Ipsos. It could be a media firm too. In the US market, sometimes you have individual polling firms publishing polls. Sometimes you have media outlets publishing polls, and sometimes you have partnerships between the two. So the first question I would always have is, can I trust this partner? Is this a credible actor producing information? The second one is, does this organization and this person, let's say this organization, this firm, do they follow the standards set by their professional organization? American Association of Public Opinion Research has something called the Transparency Initiative. It's basically for those of us who are public pollsters. We open up the underbelly, the ugliness, a little bit of the sausage. We provide information to a central clearinghouse. I would look for that. Is this polling firm, is this media outlet a subscriber to the Transparency Initiative? And lastly, and I think most importantly, and this goes for both polls in the US and other countries, a good poll should have a methodological blurb. The scientific method suggests that you have to be able to replicate what was done. If you read an article and there's not an explanation, at least in a footnote about the methods employed, they're not following best practices. So 3 things: brand, reputation, transparency initiatives in the US and/or in other countries. Are they following the ethical and professional standards of that country? And the third, ultimately, is, are they putting in that methodological blurb? Could I replicate this, or at least understand this, if I had to?
But I think in the media, and I'd be interested in what Dan Littman has to say about this. For us, I think we view polling as just another tool in a collection of tools, right? Because the polls were all wrong about Donald Trump. I mean, he was not supposed to win. This was not supposed to be the Trump convention. There was no way. Right. And anecdotally speaking, I mean, I can tell you, our own poll at Bloomberg, which is a very trusted poll, was wrong about Iowa. And I think it was the night before the Iowa caucuses, we had a poll showing that Donald Trump was actually going to win the Iowa caucus. And he ended up losing. But, you know, that's where the point that I would make is that this is really just a tool, because you look at sort of what actually happened on the ground with Senator Ted Cruz's campaign and Dr. Ben Carson and all of the different organizational apparatuses, and that matters too. So I think, to Kellyanne's point about polls, media polls influencing sort of a media narrative, I think that really can make a difference. And you know, and Jeb Bush was also supposed to win New Hampshire, and he finished behind John Kasich.
When?
In New Hampshire, not in, yeah. But even that, I think, just anecdotally, just the momentum.
I just wanted to comment on that because the Bloomberg Des Moines Register poll was so, and I'm leaving here to go on Bloomberg TV. We're friends. I love the organization.
I watched you on Hannity last night.
Let me tell you something. The Bloomberg Des Moines Register poll was quoted everywhere. And why was that? Because it wasn't a partisan poll. Okay, well, let's think about that for a moment. If you are in the business of being excellent journalists, and you're busy doing that, and you have a very credible, very reliable pollster that you did, and the partisan pollsters, whatever that means, are actually focusing on a lot of the trends that you just mentioned that are sometimes missed. If there's
Always
a conclusion, I think too many polls are a conclusion in search of evidence, frankly. It's like, this is what I think will happen. Let's see data that will make it so. So the other thing I would just say about that particular poll, because I think it's so incredibly important, if that were a Democrats poll or Republican poll, they'd be out of business. Nobody's going to put Bloomberg out of business. That's good. But
it's good for me.
The reason that poll didn't work is for another reason. You got out of the field, I think, on Friday night and had a big party releasing the poll on Saturday. There's a huge party in Des Moines releasing the poll on Saturday. The Iowa caucuses were Tuesday. Monday. You needed to stay in the field Saturday, Sunday, and part of Monday, really, to capture those 12 or 13% who were on the fence. Like, am I really going to? So I think it's great to have a party, but you should have it on Tuesday. Next time is stay in the field. We were in the field. Others were in the field. I assume the Cruz campaign was in the field. I couldn't talk to them at the time. But things happen. It's true. But I do think that if we know going into it that 13, 15, in some states 18% say, I haven't really solidified my decision. And this year, in the general election, voters are asking second for whom to vote and first whether to bother at all. And so to really capture that fully, I think you have to let it breathe in the field just a little bit longer.
I wanted to add one thing to Kevin's point, which is that about the accuracy of polls. A lot of the polls about Donald Trump have understated his support, whereby some Americans seem to not have been comfortable saying that they were supporting Donald Trump to a live pollster on the phone, even though it's an anonymous person. They're not actually, telling their friends, and so it was almost not politically correct to support him, and it still isn't in some circles of America among, I don't know, people on maybe the East Coast, the Excella corridor, that there's these hidden Trump supporters who. That was one reason he was able to do so well in the primaries, was that you had to add a couple points almost to the poll numbers, and that could be the case today. It was almost like the Brexit vote, whereby people didn't show up and they thought that Britain would stay in the EU, and they were wrong. And so I think that's one thing the Hillary Clinton campaign is worried about, is that even though they're ahead by 5 points nationally, and they're doing well in some swing states, that it's much closer than that, and that we could all get surprised on Tuesday.
And Daniel, can I pick up on that and put this to Kellyanne? How do you, within the Trump campaign, how do you target those voters, or how do you identify those voters who maybe are Democrats, really, but also Trump has the appeal to? How do you identify them, and how does that influence? Because Manafort said at a Bloomberg breakfast earlier this week that he doesn't really see this as a Democrat versus a Republican necessarily electorate in some with these independent voters. So how do you identify them, and how has that influenced your polling? And is this like any other election with that?
It's not like any other election. I can't tell you how we identify them, but I can tell you that we're very aware that there are undercover Trump voters who are just tired of arguing with family, friends, colleagues. They don't want every night to be Thanksgiving with the in-laws. And so this is why your vote is private. This is why you go into the ballot box, or you complete it and put a stamp on it and mail it in an envelope privately. I don't see a single hidden Hillary voter in this country. They're all way out. And if anything, it's first woman, Bill's wife, Barack Obama's successor, yay. And so there are undercover Trump voters. What we've been doing for years at my firm is trying to make people feel comfortable to admit how they really feel, what they really know or don't know, and how they may act on that. So I'll give you an example. Probably since about 1998, we started asking people a couple different ways to screen their likelihood to vote. I think the worst way to find out if somebody is a likely voter is to ask them, are you likely to vote? Sounds like a great idea, but it's too linear and it just gives them too many
And who's going to
excuses.
say like no if they're
Right, exactly. It's like, oh, vote, absolutely, ma'am. I'll be there at 6 a.m. The polls open at 8. I'll be there at 6 a.m. I do sit-ups every morning. I eat all my green vegetables. I go to church every Wednesday and Saturday. I never cheat on my wife for taxes. Vote, I'll be right there. So we try to make them feel really comfortable to admit that they may not vote. And we do that by saying, some people in your area say that they may not vote this year because they can't seem to find the time. They're busy with work, family, or school, or they don't think their vote counts. That really changed after 2000. Or they don't think, or they don't like the candidates or the issues being discussed this year. You know, give people a comfortable out. And so it's not perfect, but asking people on a scale of 1 to 10, do we talk to each other that way? Are you going to go out to dinner tonight with somebody and say, salmon, approve or disapprove? I mean, some of these polling questions just don't mimic the way that we speak to each other and the way we assess information and make decisions every day. Right. So I can't reveal completely, but I can tell you we're on top of it, and you're onto something in that it's very true. There's a social desirability factor for some people in saying that they're against Donald Trump. And they believe there's an economic incentive and a national security incentive to be for him in the privacy of the ballot box.
And one other point
I just wanted to make a point. I just wanted to, on our side, we're estimating that soft Trump vote or that silent Trump vote at anywhere between 3 and 6 points. I mean, it's significant. And depending how you tweak the question, and we're running a series of experiments right now, you tweak it just a little bit. You put like neither in. All of a sudden, you skim off some people. You tweak the other option, you skim off people, or you hide. And so the issue is there is this subset of people out there that have a Trump profile that don't want to verbalize it. What we think we've seen, in the primaries at least, is that those methodologies that didn't talk to people did better online. We'll see in the general, right? If that's what we call mode of administration effect. But once again, going back, there's this 3 to maybe 6% of soft Trump supporters. Now, going back to the initial point here, this is going to be a super difficult, or this is, in my opinion, a super difficult cycle to poll in. And why is that the case? Because past is not prologue. Typically, when we're polling, when we're modeling a la Nate Silver, we're forecasting out, we're using past behavior in one way or another to project what will happen. And typically that works. What we know at Ipsos, we have a database of elections around the world, 600 plus elections. 85% of all elections are slam dunks. It's more of the same, throw the bums out, continuity, change, some sort of dynamic that way. We know what's going to happen. About 15 are disruptive. They're elections where there's some sort of paradigm shift going on. Brexit, Grexit. You can take the 5-star movement in Italy, and today in the US as well. We classify this electoral cycle as a disruptive election, and to be quite frank, we're very hesitant about our methods. Because what worked in the past might not work in the future. And so what do you do in those sort of cases? You have to triangulate. You have to question everything. You have to beat up, as we say as pollsters, beat up the ballot question. Take that intention to vote question, tweak it a bunch of different ways, run the data a bunch of different ways, and question your assumptions.
Frank?
Yeah, I'm gonna put forward an opinion that may be sacrilege among our pollster friends and among our friends in journalism who often write about the polls. And that is that we live in a time of information overload, and that we have a poll every day that tells us something different, it appears. I think that it's safe to say that voters have more information at their fingertips now than ever in our history, yet use it less. I think that we have a lot of uninformed voters but they're skimming. They're saying, well, I heard that so-and-so is leading in the polls. And so I think that we've gotten to this place where polling is not just telling us what the public opinion is, but it's forming public opinion more so than it ever has in the past. And as a candidate, to me, that seems like a bandwagon effect where people aren't judging candidates based on their issues and making informed decisions about who they want the next congressperson, president, U.S. senator, et cetera, to be. But they're, in many cases, jumping on board with who looks like the popular person they want to be in that parade. And that, to me, is interesting.
How do you end up dealing with people who come to you with a poll?
Yeah.
And how much does that influence what you have to decide when you're negotiating to pass a bill or do what you're doing in the Senate, the Ohio Senate?
You know, as a legislator, I have to make decisions on a nearly daily basis, and if I tried to make those decisions based on polling, I would tie myself in a knot and drive myself crazy. I try to gauge what the opinion is within my district, and on big issues, yes, I want to consume information about what public opinion is in my district, but there's also something about being a leader, and just because something is popular in my district doesn't mean that that's the way I need to cast my vote. If I believe strongly about something and I was elected to represent this district for a reason, then I should cast my vote based on my conscience and then get out there and work the editorial boards and the Rotary clubs and tell people why and try to bring them around to that opinion. That's politically treacherous, but it's also leadership.
One other point I'd make is that while polls are definitely important and they give voters and citizens a snapshot to what their fellow citizens are thinking, and they also can lead to kind of a bandwagon effect whereby people see they like winners, they want to be with a winner. It's sometimes more important is what people in their close friend and relative circle are thinking in terms of who they're supporting. And you can think of that as there's always one person in every community or every group of friends that everyone looks towards for advice on what book everyone should read or what movie or where their nice vacation was recently. And it's the same thing with political candidates in terms of if that person at that center of that friend or family circle is voting for Trump or Hillary, it's almost like the word of mouth effect where it gives that person the seal of approval.
Yeah.
And that can be you're much more influenced by your friends around you than random strangers in a poll. And so that's one point I would make.
And I think Donald Trump tapped into that. I think, the big narrative after he lost the Iowa caucuses heading into New Hampshire was, oh my gosh, can Donald Trump turn out all of these people that are packing these stadiums? Like, these aren't, these voters have never voted before, they're disenfranchised. And I think the media did a really condescending job, quite honestly, in discussing that and thinking that people would wait in lines. To Kellyanne's point, if you ask someone, oh yeah, I'll be there at 6 a.m. and they won't, but these people were actually there at 6 a.m. for like 12 hours before Donald Trump even spoke. But I think peeling back the curtain a little bit on polling, and I hope my pollster friends don't get mad, but another huge job that what you guys do is crafting attacks and crafting messaging and framing similar to how journalists frame a news story, framing the parameters of debates. And we've seen this on both sides, not only from Hillary Clinton's campaign, but also Donald Trump's. And I would be interested in your perspective on how the parameters of this election are going to be framed and what tweaks they're going to be making and how.
Can I just wanted to respond, and
Okay.
I don't take offense, by the way.
No.
It's all good. We're all good. Now, just very quickly, I think we're focusing way too much on the horse race.
Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Always.
that's
Always.
a drop in the bucket. That's the tip of the iceberg. We do so much more. And what I can tell you is, yes, the polls on average understated Trump, but the polls said he was going to win.
True,
Let me
I
be
would
very
agree.
no, not the horse race. When you peeled away the onion, and when you asked public opinion on the key dimensions, what was important and why they were supporting him, it was very clear. Like, what did he win on? Let's ask ourselves. He won on two concepts: America first, and the system is broken. Obviously, in some ways, he was a mirror image or the reverse, 180 of Bernie Sanders, who was running not on America first as much, but the system is broken. But when you look at the data specifically and ask questions about agree, disagree, the system is rigged against people like you. What percentage of the population believes that? 80%. When you go, what percent of the population says, increasingly I no longer identify with the America of my parents? 75%. And so what you do when you peel away the onion and you stay away from the ballot question, who's going to win? Who are you going to vote for? Clinton or Trump or whomever, candidate A or candidate B, and we start asking specific issues, and you're making this point, specific issues that actually are linked to the messages and the underlying attitudes, you basically construct an analytical framework which says, man, there's no way he won't win in the primaries. I just wanted to make that additional point.
Okay, let's try and shift gears just a little bit.
Okay.
You mentioned the 80% of the country who are disillusioned or whatever. I'm not sure that looking at this election is a rational process for a lot of reasons. Okay? The anger in our country, I think, has been building for a long time. We've talked about basic communication and how it's fragmented and overloaded. And my question for you guys is, knowing that everybody is skeptical of what you are doing, and it's affecting this election in particular, because if you look at the way that politicians, and I see Mr. Trump as using the tools that politicians have available to them better than a lot of other people, and he's also following a historical pattern that people who have created mass movements in the past used, along with his book, which feeds into that kind of thing. How can you, doing what you're doing, help combating this, what's going on in the country? Transparency is one thing, but we are all so removed from each other, and I guess one of the things that I wonder about when you're making phone calls, are you taking into account where people live?
Always.
Because
otherwise, you don't know if you have a scientific poll, because you have
because
to represent.
we're all clustered.
I'm not
in
sure I
groups.
totally understand what you're saying. It sounds a little anti-Trump at the end, but I'll try here.
Okay.
Or at the beginning, actually. Maybe the whole thing, but I'll try.
Okay.
So, first of all, I'm an opponent of saying the country is angry and the voters are angry. I think it's become this accepted wisdom. I sit this close to people in focus groups. They're not angry, they're worried, and they feel betrayed, and they're very frustrated.
Right.
And they have jobs, or they don't, but even households that have 2-3 jobs can't pay the bills. And they're wondering, how the hell did this happen? That we live a productive life, we're working hard, and yet we're white-knuckled at the end of each month to pay the rent and meet basic needs. They're not trying to afford a luxurious lifestyle. So I think calling the entire electorate and the population, and people have done it right, left, and center this year, angry, really, I think, gets the politicians and the rigged system Donald Trump is talking about in all of Washington off the hook too easily. Putting that's too much of a burden on the people is what I mean. And so I can't accept that really as an apt descriptor. The other thing is, why in the world, if you want to talk about this, go follow the Twitter feeds of some journalists. It is a disgrace. And I've called them out on it. Not all of them, because I'm lying in wait for a little bit more juice, but it's a disgrace. To actually say retweets are not my own, or retweets are my own, retweets are not. Really, at 10:46 a.m. when you're supposed to be sitting at that print journalist job, these are your own? What are you doing? You might as well play video games. And some of these tweets are out and out opinion journalism, peddling insults, name calling. I'm not even going to repeat it. Why would I? Name calling. That's corrosive. And that really betrays their profession. That would be like me running polling questions that say, Hillary Clinton is really a mass murderer who takes the wings off of butterflies. Would you be more likely to vote for her or less likely? Is that strongly or somewhat?
Sure.
And the other thing I just wanted to say is, I think it's so easy. Listen, I recognize Donald Trump is far more fascinating to cover than Hillary Clinton. Who wants to fall asleep during the day?
I agree.
But yes, of course. So there's just outsized coverage of him. But explain to me why and how it's civil and how it's helpful and how it's unifying to have Hillary Clinton last August refer to pro-life Republicans as, quote, terrorists. Was that helpful?
No.
Can't you just say you disagree? Or can't you just use the usual anti-woman stuff with the big frown on your face that you usually do? Terrorists? Did anybody ever hear that? No, it got very little coverage. There's a reason you didn't hear it.
Right.
And that's unfair. Number two, why last week when Mike Pence, who was chosen to be the VP running mate, why did Elizabeth Warren tweet out the following? Donald Trump and Mike Pence are the same. Quote, two small, weak, insecure men. Two small, weak, insecure men. Did that help with civility? Is that unifying? Is it even substantive? It's a schoolyard taunt. It's an insult about their manhood.
Exactly.
Am I out there saying when Elizabeth Warren and Hillary Clinton are standing next to each other, am I commenting, hey, you menopausal, miserable women? I mean, it's so ridiculous, and it's not civil, and you didn't see it, and it didn't get covered because it's not Donald Trump.
I wanted to ask.
Wait. That's exactly the issue that we're concerned about here. Stuart is looking at values and what Americans believe and who we are, and I'm looking at specific guidelines for what you can and cannot say. It comes out of the Old Testament. We've cleaned it up. It's secular. Everybody that I've showed it to seems to agree with it. But where do you start? How do you get people to understand that this name calling and this, all of this stuff that's going on is not productive?
Well, they love it. They do it in their own lives.
Let's understand, too, that it's nothing new. George Washington wrote a little red book called The Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior. He decried the rise of partisanship in his exit speech when he left the Oval Office. We've had members of Congress beating members of the Senate with a cane, and we've had a vice president and a secretary of the Treasury in a pistol duel. It's been bad before, but we are in positions of trust and authority as people that provide information, as people that do public opinion research, as people that cast votes on behalf of 300,000 other people. And so we have to start holding ourselves and those around us to a higher standard as it relates to civility. This is a challenge that our generation should face and should embrace, and it's not just about being nicer to each other. It's about doing a better job of governing, because when we can get past the ad hominem nonsense, we can start talking about substantive issues and how we're going to lead. And the voters, the citizens, have a responsibility in this as well. They have to hold their candidates to a higher standard and not react and not. We as elected officials are going to do what works. And if name calling and insults gets us votes, then we're going to do that a lot. And we're going to do that as often as possible. But if the people start to demand better, and maybe I'm being too idealistic here, but if the people are going to demand better, then we'll give them that.
But one thing I wanted to kind of jump in on was you brought up a great point, Kellyanne, about the Elizabeth Warren tweet, where it's hard for at least Elizabeth Warren and someone in Hillary's camp to make that civility argument if they're going to be, insulting and, with videos and tweets. But what do you make of their argument that if you talk about civility and name calling, that Donald Trump has, he was kind of almost famous for in the primary process for assigning his primary opponents nicknames that really kind of cut at them in a very deep way that really helped him win the primary process. But a lot of Republican establishment politicians, they kind of decried the name calling that they saw that Donald Trump was doing. I was just wondering
I'm sure they have. The best one of all is Crooked Hillary. So there's that. And partly because 2/3 of the country says that she's not honest and trustworthy. Those are media polls, by the way.
Right.
All the media polls say that. 58% say she's corrupt. I don't remember even having the word corrupt in presidential polling questions before she was a candidate. So if anybody's going to deny there's a double standard and there's not outsized coverage of Donald Trump and what he says, then we might as well just deflate the tent. There is, and it's been measured, and that's easy to see. But it's also, what I would say to you is the reason I believe that by the end of next week in Philadelphia, that convention will have felt, people will remember President Obama, President Bill Clinton, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, all four of whom are much more popular than Hillary Clinton within the Democratic Party and much more dynamic to listen to and exciting to listen to. It'll be remembered as sort of who spoke on her behalf. This feels like Donald Trump's convention. And that tells you something about where people want to focus on one thing he said or how he said it. A lot of the country focuses on these attributes, strong leadership. There's a great example of using polls, being selective about what polling data ends up driving news coverage. So I looked at these Quinnipiac state polls about 6 weeks ago. And I was struck by in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and I believe it was Florida, maybe it was Virginia, but 3 swing states. I was struck how Donald Trump in these publicly available polls was leading among men by double digits and a little bit among women on the question of, is he a strong leader? You're like, yes, he's a strong leader, he's a strong leader. Hillary Clinton was doing better on temperament, really much better on temperament. So I looked at that, I made a comment, I made a couple slides, I shared them. And then the very next day, and for the next 6 weeks, what do we all hear about constantly? Temperament, 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 temperament. Do you remember hearing that in 2008? Do you remember hearing that in 2012? Of course not. So there's a certain selectivity, and now all of a sudden it's qualifications. President Obama says Hillary Clinton is the most qualified person to ever run for president. If any of us had qualifications and experience in 2008, when the inexperienced Barack Obama was running, this is not an experience election, this is a change election, this is a change. So there's a certain selectivity based on perfectly legitimate polling questions of what people hear is important to them. I have faith in the voters. I think voters end up telling us what's important to them at the ballot box and will not be told how to think, what to believe. Speaking of the horse race, this is the best election cycle ever in my view for how ridiculous the horse race number truly is, to your point. The fiction of electability, who can win, who can't win, who totally blown to smithereens.
Well, and on the horse race thing, as somebody that was working on one of the presidential campaigns, not the one that ended up winning the primary, I was constantly frustrated by this notion that we're doing these polls in a national sample when it may be only several hundred or thousand a sample for a nation of several hundred million. And we don't do primaries that way. We do them state by state. So why are we putting these national polling numbers up when we don't conduct primaries in that manner? But most voters don't even realize that. They say, well, so-and-so's leading in the polls. I say, well, how are they doing in New Hampshire? How are they doing in South Carolina? But people don't know that.
That's part of the problem.
Yeah.
There's so much information, like you said, and it's so fragmented. And with technology, you're just bombarded with information, and then you wonder why the 80% of the country is not participating. I think it's sensory overload in a lot of ways. And the question is, how do we do that? And you guys are trying as hard as you can to do, a reasonable poll, get objective opinions, double check what the information that you're giving out is. And you guys are the ones who are using that information, or the politicians are using it to guide their campaigns. And, how can we make a change? That's the question that we're asking. Because there is so much, I won't use the term anger, people are concerned. They're afraid, they don't know where things are going, they see violence increasing, and they're looking for a way out of all this, which unfortunately I think is not an emotional decision. We've got to somehow get through our fear and trust the information that we're getting and realize that we have to do it from both ends. Frank, you're working with politicians like yourself behind the scenes, and the public. And yesterday afternoon, for those of you who weren't here, one of the panelists stopped short and said, you guys are the ones that have to push this. And I agree on both ends. I think we have to hold them accountable, you can't put up with some of the stuff that you're getting, and we have to resolve together, to put out the information objectively. And I guess the question I've got is, negativity sells. You don't write your own headlines, I would bet. And how does the media help calm things down?
Well, I mean, I would first say that when you have shooting after shooting after shooting, it is not the media's job to ignore events.
Exactly.
A shooting in Orlando deserves the coverage it gets. A shooting in Nice the attack in Nice deserved the coverage that it gets. Now, does Melania and Michelle deserve the coverage that got yesterday? No, it didn't quite.
Thank you.
Honestly. But
Breaking news.
but
Every 10
but let me take a step back. I hear what you're saying with regards to the media, and let's be candid. People don't like the media any more than they don't like really Congress or politicians or really anything else. We're just as unliked. But there is power. This is
I like you, Kevin.
I like you too, Daniel. But there is power in what you click. And I think to Kellyanne's point about just the acidic nature on Twitter, I mean, it's crazy. I mean, it really is crazy. But there is power in what you click, and there's power in what you consume, and there's power in what websites you go on, and what magazines you read, what newspapers you read, and what journalists you follow. And I think that is where the public really does have a choice of what they watch, what they comment on, and what they click. Because if you're clicking a Melania and Michelle news story, then the owners of whatever website or
do more, yeah.
or the cable news network graphs that show the viewers going up, that's what they're going. That's what you're telling them you want to consume, and so your news diet does have a huge influence on the political discourse and what we all are following.
And one point I'd add is that I would almost say it's like you vote with your feet.
Yes.
That's like you vote with your mouse and what you click on. And in terms of the divisions that it seems that the media sometimes adds to the public discourse, I think the cable news is one problem in that it really amplifies the divisions in America in terms of it shows basically what it almost makes politics to be a war between both sides, and it doesn't. Very rarely do you see news stories in cable television or broadcast news about the things that America does agree on and the policy plans that people want to get done. And so you don't hear about infrastructure that most people want to fix, and schools which people want to really, it's really the wedge issues that are talked about. And if the media focus more on some of the things that unite us, then that could probably lead to good things for the country.
But I would just add quickly that it's all out there. Like Donald Trump's plan on immigration, Hillary Clinton's plan on immigration, it's all on the and that's where I think, we can bash cable all we want, we can bash websites all we want to. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, I mean, there are pluses and minuses to each outlet. But I mean, I'm a consumer of news, and one of the main questions I get as a journalist is, how do you get your news? And you have to go to a variety of different outlets. If you're a Republican and you're not watching MSNBC, then you're not knowing how the left is framing something, and vice versa. So have a diverse news diet.
Okay, you're dying to say something. Would you like to participate? This is the communications teacher at Kent State. To be honest, it's a matter of.
I'm just going to make a general point about.
Okay.
Specific points, sorry, about a couple things that were said. First and foremost, I agree there's a lot of information out there, but there's going to be a lot more. And that's the long-term trend. The cost of producing a poll is going down precipitously, It's very, very cheap to do one now, and that means there's a lower barrier to entry, right? And you can use that as a metaphor to think about everything. There's going to be information. There's going to be explosion of information everywhere. And so the question is, how do you navigate those things? And I think that, I sat through the conferences and the discussions today. You think maybe stepping back and taking a 30,000-foot view of the long-term trends. So bear with me, right? But for a big chunk of human history, we interacted in geographic space. We born, we lived, we died in one place.
Right.
Right? We knew people, we knew rich people, we knew poor people, we interacted with them. I can even go back to when I was in high school, grew up in a mid-sized suburban city in the Chicago area. My high school had everyone, rich kids, poor kids, everyone in between. We are no longer bounded by space.
Right.
Right? We're not bounded by space, so those of us who want to move. So nowadays I live in Potomac, Maryland. Great place to live, by the way, but my kids don't interact with the kids I interacted with. When I was a kid, I had two sets of friends. The set of friends that I had classes with, and the set of kids I had played sports with. They're completely different. The one set are doctors, lawyers, people with PhDs. The other set are plumbers, firemen, and working people, right? And so we're no longer bounded by space, and the basic social science is bearing this out, whether on the right or the left. It's showing that increasingly we're segregating in space by socioeconomic and economic status and income. And on the other hand, we're increasingly segregated virtually. Because no longer do I have to listen to you. I don't have to do that. And I just go, and I can find people that like what I like. If I like to play Dungeons and Dragons underwater, upside down, I will find a subset of people in the world through the internet that way. The internet is a extraordinarily wonderful and scary aggregating force, okay? So where am I going with this a bit? So, and actually, just talking about polling, the challenges of polling are a reflection of this change in the way we interact. It was really easy to knock on doors or call people. We no longer can call people so easily. Only 10% of the US population uses landline only. Only 50% have a landline at home. So the way we interact is changing. And so there's a couple things, and I'm thinking about issues of creating mechanisms for greater dialogue. How do we, I no longer, and this is the point that was made in the first session, we talk about the public place. We talk about the editorial page of the local newspaper. We talk about the public park, the public square where everyone would go and discuss things.
The purple tent.
The purple tent. Right. We no longer have those things like we did. I don't have the solution, obviously, but one thing I could say is technology will resolve in the long term. Crowdsourcing, the ability to interact and give feedback online, the ability to me to be heard. I had someone interview me just about an hour ago doing Facebook Live. He just took out his phone and interviewed me. That's an immensely sort of democratizing sort of experience.
This is a really interesting dynamic. No, sorry.
No, go ahead, man.
There's a book about this idea called The Big Sort by a guy named Bennett that I read not too long ago. I'm a nerd.
It's one of Bill Clinton's favorite books.
What's that?
Sort.
It's one of Bill Clinton's favorite books, The Big Sort.
Wonderful.
One of mine too.
What's the name of the book?
It's called The Big Sort.
Big Sort.
And it's about this idea that we're essentially gerrymandering ourselves. I mean, we're putting ourselves, you can tell a whole hell of a lot about somebody based on their zip code. It's really remarkable.
Self-selected.
And it's caused this polarization because I'm part of the elephant tribe, and darn it, I'm going to go to war against the donkey tribe. And the people that I live with that are around me are part of that tribe, and I consume information that's from that tribe. Right. And this is a problem in America.
And I no longer am empathetic with the other.
Sure.
I was going to say, that's right. They also think they're right.
Yeah.
That
Well,
they're
they
right.
know
'Cause
they're
everyone
right.
around them thinks the same thing.
Yeah.
So can I ask Kellyanne a question? Because I mean, again, like you're Donald Trump's pollster, and so because when I've interviewed him, and I'm sorry,
Let's not pick on
I'm not picking on her. No, I don't think she thinks I'm picking on her either. But
Good.
yeah.
Chill.
But so when I've interviewed Donald Trump, and when he knows every poll, he keeps them in his pocket. He's living. He's like this poll, that poll. Take us in the room. What is it like? What is it like to get to? Or what is that dynamic like in terms of? And if you can't take us in Mr. Trump's room, when you're with a principal candidate? Walk us through that process.
Trump is one of the best political candidates I've ever worked with, and I've been doing it for decades because he loves information. How has he built his business? How has he been successful? He keeps the counsel of many, many people. You heard his son Don Jr. last night say something that everyone who knows him in business vouches for, which is he's so comfortable speaking to the pipe fitter, the electrician, the folks on the ground who are building the building as well. He always wants to know what's going on in the back area of one of his buildings. I mean, he's just somebody who's always absorbed information and data and people's impressions and best practices. And so it's no different here, but you better know your stuff because he's really thought it all through. And I think Trump is different than most typical politicians in the following way. And this crosses party lines for sure.
We're running into
I believe he's ineffective. He became the Republican nominee in part because he first understood the cultural zeitgeist. To attract people politically, you must first understand them culturally. And he was on The Apprentice, looking at ratings, looking at camera angles, figuring out what the public wanted to see. His daughter sells a very successful line of housewares and clothing and shoes to all of America. It's available everywhere. I've seen it everywhere. And so to understand, I think people in politics traditionally look at us all as voters, which is not how we look at ourselves by and large. And so there's something to that. But he's a great absorber of information and data and wants to know way beyond the horse race.
Right. I think that we're running into time issues now, and I think my impression, and I'm going to sort of tie up this whole thing if I can, we all have opinions, we all are distant from each other, like you've said, Frank, you've talked about leadership and how in the big sort, how we're compartmentalizing ourselves as in gerrymandering. I don't know that there is an answer for this stuff. What I think we need to do is have more meetings like this, understand where we came from and what our values are, and figure out some way to personalize the communication that is so bouncing all around us. I see the world as very fragmented for a whole lot of reasons. But we've got to remember that we're all pretty much the same if you're on the blue side or the red side or the whatever side. Talk it out. Figure out a way to get past wherever you're coming from, get out of your shell, and just talk.
Like you were talking about how America's kind of segregating into the different communities of like-minded people. Like my favorite thing to mention about that is that if you look at the New York Times Sunday wedding announcements, it's the last couple pages in the Sunday Style section, and it's basically the elite, the 1 or 2% of America marrying each other, and where it's a lawyer from Harvard marries a lawyer from Yale, or two people in finance marry each other, or journalism, and it used to be more cross marrying into different pools of people, where you would have a lawyer marry their secretary, or someone from the different economic stratospheres marry each other, and that is only creating more income inequality and social inequality, given that it's impossible to really break into that unless you really do very well in work. And so there's that's a real change in how society operates, and I think that's having a big effect because
of course.
It doesn't bode well for then everyone thinks the same and they all go to the same parties, and I know Kevin and I probably recognize people on that page every week or two. So
I agree.
I just
Sure.
want to, I know that we're running out of time. I just want to add my own question to the panel just to wrap things up. I heard from somebody the other day a comment that he reads the newspaper every day or news clips every day for good news, but he only finds the good news in the obituary section. Because in the obituaries, you could see how people lived their lives.
Right.
Is the media shining a light for all of us to follow? Quick question from each of you.
I think that you read the good news in the obituaries because people wait until other people are dead to say something nice about them.
Yeah, I was just going to say, going back to this discussion about profoundly changing society, I don't read the newspaper anymore, but I get a lot of news. So I've broken an old habit. I used to read the paper every day, a number of papers every day. It's a habit. You wake up in the morning, you get the paper, maybe you go online a little bit later, maybe a few years, you go online, you take a look, maybe you have breakfast or coffee, and you go to work, right? I no longer do that. And I don't know how I get all the information I do, but I do. And I think that, on the one hand, a fascinating, kind of interesting sort of future with a lot of social and economic negative implications.
I used to be like in the apartment building I live in Washington, D.C. There's probably maybe 80 to 100 residents who live in it, and I am probably the only one or two residents, including myself, get the New York Times in print every day because it comes straight to the door. And if you look at apartment buildings around DC, it's like so few anymore. And that's kind of one indication of that habit, which has totally gone away. Whereby if you're reading a print newspaper, I don't want to be like the dinosaur on this panel, and it's kind of funny that I'm only 26, but if you read a print newspaper, you're
Old soul.
I'm the dinosaur.
you're browsing fellow dinosaurs unite. You're browsing through like the entire paper, and you're seeing the op-eds, the art section, the science times, the food pages, and you're really taking it in all, even if you're just reading headlines or a couple articles. And online, you can just rely on what your friends are posting on Facebook and what's on Twitter, and that doesn't really cover everything that you need to know.
And I would just say that you're not looking hard enough if you're not finding good news. Look harder, because there's good news. You just got to look harder, because it's there. And you know what? I read Politico Playbook now, and I always have. But there's good news. There's some good news in Politico Playbook. Daniel Littman puts it in there. A little bit.
We have the weddings and engagements.
And they're marrying, across, Okay.
I think that's incredibly pessimistic. I think that there's good news out there, and I think that you don't go to news necessarily, or you shouldn't, maybe some do, for entertainment. It's not what you want to know, it's what you need to know to be an informed citizen. And journalists are doing their jobs by putting that stuff in there that's not often good news, but it's what you need to know to be an informed citizen. Why I, as a millennial, am one of the few people that walks to the end of his driveway. I'm not lucky enough to live in New York. I live in a beautiful place in Ohio, though. I walk to the end of my driveway and I pick up my newspaper because it provides opportunities for serendipity. I don't get that when I'm clicking around on a website. If I'm paging through the paper, and I like the tactile aspect of it too, as I'm paging through the paper, things pop out at me that I would have never seen online, and that's what I like about it.
And my goal is just to make polling great again. So I gotta go.
And what did that
Thanks,
say?
everybody.
Make polling great
Oh,
again.
that's great.
See,
Thanks, everybody, for watching. The audience here. That's
cool.
Educators, it's up to you to continue the dialogue in the fall. Thanks, everybody, for being here in the Purple Tent.
I love New York.